We will therefore first start with a brief presentation of the report by my colleague Vanya Skoric, Program Director at ECNL. This will be followed by a reflection on this report by my dear friend and colleague Tasneem Anwar. After the presentation, we will have enough room for Q&A and discussion, so you're more than happy to ask your questions either through chat or raising your hand and taking the floor. And before closing the workshop, we will also have the opportunity to discuss in smaller groups the draft guidance for civil society organizations, which we already circulated beforehand. So having said this, now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Vanya to give us the first presentation of today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Berna, and thank you all for joining today. I know it's not easy concentrating on different topics when so much is going on around us, but we do feel that this topic actually is very relevant in the context of the situation that is happening in Ukraine and in other parts of the world where financial and humanitarian assistance is very much needed. So with that need, the need to actually have financial access and flow of funding for nonprofit organizations becomes crucial and even a lifeline in some situations. So therefore, we want to really continue discussing this topic. And this is just one of the first workshops we'll have on this particular topic. When we talk about de-risking and financial actions and access, I just want to look through a little bit of terminology and jargon that unfortunately we tend to use and immediately apologize for using some of the jargon. But maybe what would be helpful is just to mention then when you see written NPO, it's a nonprofit organization, meaning broader civil society organization. When you see written FATF, it's a financial action task force. FY stands for financial institution, usually the bank. STR is a suspicious transaction report that banks file. IML is anti-money laundering, CFT is countering terrorism financing, and CDD is customer due diligence. We'll mention some of these terms as we go along with the presentation. And when we talk about de-risking, which is in the terms of financial institutions and banks actually denying some of the financial services or financial access, we know based on all of the previous research and work that has already been done that it's very complex and multifactored. Many of you have also done work on this topic with us or in parallel, and it's driven by a lack of regulatory support and guidance. There is an absence of incentives to actually address de-risking in any meaningful way. And it's also a result of the low profit and high costs that banks and financial institutions incur when they deal with nonprofit clients. So really with this report, what we aimed to do is provide practical insight into what the actual process within the financial institution, within the bank is ongoing, from the phase of onboarding, meaning taking on a client, in this case, the nonprofit organization, and through the phase of monitoring how the transactions are being conducted by the nonprofit organization. We also provide some of the insight and recommendations for further action in tackling actually the root causes for financial exclusion. We are looking here in the report at current concrete banking practices and issues. So we don't go into the analysis, particularly if these actual practices that are researched in the report and reported by multiple interviewees from the banks, if they are fully compatible with the FATF standards or international standards on human rights law and humanitarian law issues. If you go through the report, you will see some of the respondees, some of the interviews providing information that will immediately kind of struck you as, this is not really something that should be happening on the ground. Yes, we know that, but purposefully we provide information on what the practice is without actually going into further analysis whether this is okay or not okay from the point of view of human rights law and IML and CFT standards. So we'll look at actually two key phases, and I can ask my colleague Anna maybe to put the report link in the chat again. You have had it in your email, but maybe you can also want to follow afterwards through the report in more details. So we look at the first phase. How do banks determine suspicious transactions for the NPO sector after the onboarding? And how does that actually then translate into de-risking, into denying the services for nonprofit organizations? And when we look at the process, the first phase of the process, the onboarding process, meaning the taking on the nonprofit organization as a client, has its challenges. So the usual procedure for any client from financial institution point of view is to actually do a full research discussion with the client about their future expected transactions or activities or priorities before the account opening. And that includes also conducting a full due diligence process, so-called customer due diligence process. So what was explained to us within our interviewees is that the banks want to establish full profile on the nonprofit organization, their expected transactions, expected activities, expected risk level, and so on. So you can always find additional information about how this process actually flows and how it works in the report. And there are numerous explanations on the internet where you can see how this process is divided into different stages. And I'm sure some of you have participated in this process. It is very similar as when we are opening a bank account as a physical person. What was stressed to us in this approach is two different types of situations. In one situation, most of the interviewees from our research said that they treat nonprofit organizations as any other ordinary client. So essentially, they said, we do not automatically apply a high-risk designation to nonprofit organizations. Each organization is assessed based on its risk profile itself. However, we did have interviewees, for example, a bank from Turkey, that said we do classify NPOs as high risk because of our regulatory requirements. And that means they are immediately entered into this so-called enhanced due diligence, meaning more stringent reviews, requirements, monitoring, and so on. And you can imagine only one of these approaches is actually risk-based approach in line with the FATF standards. And I'm sure you've guessed the first approach is in line with the FATF standards and is risk-based because they treat every client, every NPO based on what they actually do and what their activities actually are, whether they are, a little bit risky or not. However, we know many countries where they treat where the banking and financial institutions treat the nonprofit sector as higher risk, unfortunately still. In the second phase of monitoring transactions, the important part that we need to be aware of, and that is the basis of our guidance that we will discuss later, is the lens through which the banks and financial institutions monitor the ongoing transactions and financial activity of the organization. Essentially, if the transactions and activities are not in line or aligned to expected profile that was given at the beginning of the relationship, so the profile and activities and transactions that were mapped as expected during the onboarding, any such activity that deviates from that profile will be flagged as suspicious. So that brings us into situations of possible confusions, because the criteria and principles used for monitoring transactions for nonprofit organizations seem reasonable. So they cite out of character behavior, countries at risk, different adverse media reports, screening against the sanction list, anti-terrorist screening. So if the persons or entities are on the watch list for terrorists or sanctions, any different buzzwords that ring alarm bell. However, when you look at the details of such criteria and examples, things become more complicated. Examples. We'll give you an examples of red flags for suspicious transactions for non-profit organizations. Unusual transaction frequency and volume. What is unusual? Transactions with high-risk countries. Okay, but sometimes they might be very justifiable. For example, where humanitarian aid is needed. Cross-border payments that are out of character. What is out of character? Transactions with politically exposed persons. Okay, there is a list of politically exposed persons, so this can be pretty straightforward. Transactions for which there does not appear to be a logical economic purpose or a link between NPO's stated activity or other parties in transaction. Who can judge that? Do bank staff know really and recognize what is the logical economic purpose for a particular non-profit organization? Unusual or atypically large cash withdrawals, particularly after the bank refuses the wiring of the funds. Now that might be because of the increased need for certain activities. Adverse media stories involving NPOs, staff or partners. I mean, in the age of fake news, this is just very, very difficult to justify. It's very vague. The NPO is linked to a known terrorist organization or entity on the watch list. Again, there are entities on these watch lists that in one country are considered terrorists, but by the same country communities are considered legitimate NPOs. Buzzwords included in the transaction. Some of them are obvious, but some of them could be less obvious. For example, in the last workshop, we heard colleagues saying that if they include Gaza in their transaction name, they will get immediately red flags. So what we are trying to say is, from the banking perspective, these red flags might be reasonable and obvious. However, from the NPO perspective, some of these might be just regular activities, whereas the bank does not see them as regular activities because they don't understand or don't know what NPOs actually do. So the question becomes, do we speak the same language from the nonprofit side and from the banking side, from their experience with clients? And in stories and experiences that we have collected and heard from you and other colleagues, it is often not the case that banks and NPOs speak the same language. So it's very unclear and vague how some of these criteria is being understood and used by the bank. So for example, the bank can consider a suspicious transaction to when an organization receives odd amounts from anonymous sources. It can be a simple fundraising effort or crowdfunding campaign. Or if an organization is making a transfer to high-risk countries, it may be delivering emergency aid to people in crisis. So all of these kind of get lost in the maze of paperwork, different rules and regulation, different contexts and different complex processes. And it seems that a lot of times we get lost in not speaking the same language. So I'll just list some key issues and recommendations from the report, and then we'll continue discussion. So one of the key issues was identified as lack of incentives for regulators, so for the governmental side, to actually provide additional support and guidance to both financial institutions, banks, and nonprofit sector to better understand each other and to better apply the real risk-based approach. There are, of course, various risks faced by banks which are not accounted for, which is again on the side of regulator to alleviate and discuss with financial institutions. There are, of course, high banking fees that are applied to nonprofit sector because of the increased costs by the banks. On the other side, the recommendations include identifying additional tools to provide additional guidance and support to both nonprofit sector, but also the banks on how to better apply this risk-based approach. So not to treat all of the NPOs as high risk, and also to understand better what are the NPO activities really on the ground and why some strange transactions from their point of view are actually happening and are a normal practice from the NPO side. And of course, additional educational material and support to NPO sector was identified as crucial. And this is what we are really trying to do today and further on with our guidance. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to hear more questions and discuss further later on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vanya, for giving us this brief overview of the main findings of the report. I would now like to introduce our guest panelist, Tasneem Anwar. She's a assistant professor at the Department of Criminology at the VU University, and our research background is, amongst others, on the prosecution and investigation of terrorism financing and financial exclusion issues. The floor is yours, Tasneem.
Thank you so much. I will just start to share my screen first. First of all, I want to thank ECNL for the invitation to provide some of the reflections on this really excellent report, and also commend them with the detail and precise description of how this compliance works in practice, because I think indeed one of the assets of this report is that it really captures the complex practices that are that make part this anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing system in which we all participate, or under which we are all subject, because all of us, even as private individuals, have a bank account, and it's virtually impossible to exist without a bank account. So this is something that really is important to all of us. So I think it's great that you have paid such careful attention to this issue, and in particular now with some guidance for the NPO sector. So what I will do in this reflection is that I will start with maybe two broader reflections, zooming out a little bit from the report to some developments of how we got here. And then I will kind of pick up where Vanya ended her presentation, and to look more specifically at the recommendations, which are truly excellent. What I will try to do is provide some reflections on how these recommendations might turn out into practice, or what kind of hesitations banks or NPOs themselves might have. So, and I hope that will be useful. I'll try to keep it short so we have enough time for Q&A, because I think that that's also very valuable. But maybe to kick off with some broader reflections on this whole idea that we can counter money laundering and terrorism financing. So this is actually a relative new development for countering terrorism financing. So anti-money laundering practices have been regulated previously by the FATF, but after 9/11, terrorism financing has been added to the mandate of the Financial Action Task Force. And not to give you a whole historical overview, but it's important to notice that banks or financial institutions are relatively new as gatekeepers of the whole financial system, because historically banks, of course, are just a commercial company. Their objective is to make profit, not necessarily to keep the financial system safe, because historically they're not really perceived or identified themselves as a security actor. But now, because of these regulations, they have found themselves at the forefront of the fight against financial crime, on which terrorism financing and money laundering are some examples. So I think it's important to understand that banks also have taken up this new role as a security actor, which not always sits well, I think, with the identity of a bank. And you can see this also in several reports where banks have been fined, for example, for not really complying with the regulations. And you see also that banks themselves sometimes struggle with this new role. So I think this is important as a broader reflection, important to know that banks as security actors are relatively new to this game. Then secondly, as Vanya said, the FATF recommends a risk-based approach. And I think that it's important also to notice, and it was mentioned in the report, that risk is not something that is static or something that is always very self-evident. Risk is something that is socially constructed, and it might differ per country, per political situation, what is considered risky. And I think that, so acknowledging this political and also very subjective nature of what risk is important also to gain a better understanding of what's happening under this AML-CTF framework. And as such, this better understanding can also help us navigate better the kind of minefield that we find ourselves sometimes in. So I want to briefly touch upon some of the recommendations of the report. And I listed a few of them here. In the interest of time, I won't really go in depth in all of them. But I think that the report really beautifully sets out some of the issues that can be taken up and that can improve the relationship, for example, between the NPO sector and financial institution, or at least challenge de-risking practices. And I've listed some of them here. So they are identifying tools for guidance and communication, the national risk assessments to better understand the risk attached to NPOs, clear responsibilities for stakeholders, and to solve some of the high banking fees issues. Vanya already briefly touched upon them. And so what I will do is to just stand still with some of the recommendations that can hopefully then spur some discussion after this presentation. So the first recommendation that I want to talk about is this enhancing the communication between the banks and the financial institutions. And this is done under this notion of know your customer. So the banks need to know their clientele, they need to know who they are entering a relationship with. And I think that what's important here, and this is also underlined in the report, is that know your customer has really become this kind of checkbox ticking exercise where banks need to make sure that they don't take too risky customers into their client base. And what is lacking is a true attention to who the customer is. And in that sense, you can really see this historical role of banks. Their expertise mainly lies with checking whether business companies are structured in a logical way and that they are not kind of fraudulent or money laundering schemes. When it comes to NPOs, there is very little expertise on how NPOs actually work, how their structure should look like, how they function. And if there is some expertise, this is considered then relevant for the whole NPO sector. And there's very little attention to the fact that the NPO sector is very broad and diverse. So I think that know your customer here is important in the sense that the banks could use some expertise or experience with the diversity of the NPO sector and really understand to be able to distinguish risky from non-risky the way that they also can do for business companies. But there's also a role, I think, for NPOs to take the banks by the hand and to maybe explain the obvious for them, but not for financial institutions. I'd like to bring to attention one new initiative by the Dutch bank that is supposed to help with that. They are creating a platform or a tool that is supposed to bring these two actors together so that banks can give more information on the kind of formats that they use, the kind of language that is preferred, because oftentimes it's also a bureaucratic mismatch, right? Not that can be solved by bringing these two together. I also think that this could help NPOs take the bank more by the hand. So be more open in communication about what they're doing, about what the normal structure is in their work-wise. In that sense, know your customer or know the relationship can really become strengthened. I think this is can be an example for best practice, but we have to see how it works out in practice, right? Because it's really important that this diversity and unique sense of the NPO needs to be recognized and taken into account. Oh, sorry, I just also forgot one thing that I wanted to add here. I think it's important in this platform tool as well that the person who does the compliance check, because what's interesting to know is that the first people who do the compliance check are often recently graduates, right? So they really don't really know well how the NPO sector works. So when communicating with these financial institutions, this is also important to keep in mind that, yeah, there really is this kind of imbalance in expertise. Sorry, just wanted to mention that it's interesting to think about who actually sees the alert when you make a transaction. Then on the recommendation of the national risk assessment, I think I had some, I hope that's okay, but I had some critical reflection on this recommendation. National risk assessments are, in that sense, a useful venue, I think, to provide more context about why certain actors are risk or how they become vulnerable, and how this can be taken into account by several security actors. But there's also a pitfall in using national risk assessments, right? So, for example, the Dutch national risk assessment has been under a lot of criticism. And as you can see, I added also one of the tables that was in the risk assessment of 2019. I'm sorry for the non-Dutch speaking among us, but I will, of course, translate. But it places in the high box, it places charity and other kind of, it's difficult to translate into English, but other kind of legal forms, among them a lot of organizations that you would call part of the NPO sector, in the highest potential terrorism financing threats. So this is important to notice because the national risk assessment can, on the one hand, give more context and nuance the image of what a risky, what kind of sectors are vulnerable to terrorist threats. But it can also reinforce the idea that NPOs are by default risky. And it really depends on what kind of methods they use and what kind of expertise. In comparison, we can see here the national risk assessment by the UK. Very low risk score, right? So it's something that's a bit tricky, I think, to use as an absolute truth. Then thirdly, I think it's important that the report recommends participation of NPOs, which I would like to add at every step of the way. So I think that the way that, for example, the platform tool by the Dutch bank works is very much at the end of the chain. So when the regulation has been done, when practices have caused issues, when NPOs have de-risked, that's the moment when we talk about a seat at the table where NPOs can then, talk with banks or financial institutions to talk about how to improve the communication. What I think that this whole process shows is that the participation of such a group as NPOs, which is fundamental to our democratic society, should be one of inclusion by design. So the participation of NPOs should be included at every step of the way. I don't want to make any bold statements of whose responsibility it is to be included, but I think it's an important reflection to make. Then finally, the report also recommends the use of AI and technology to make the monitoring process by banks faster, more objective, and more efficient. To this, I think that AI really does have the potential to do that. But similar to the risk assessment, it also has the potential to reinforce kind of the stereotypical idea of NPOs. So, and I think in that sense, it's important to know that we shouldn't treat it as a silver bullet, but it's something that can be used to enhance, to enhance the communication or the fairness of the monitoring process, but it can also be used to exclude and to reproduce kind of stereotypical idea of a risky sector that has not clear communications with the bank. So in that sense, I think that similar to the risk assessment, we should be very careful in adopting it as the solution to better communication between FIs and NPOs, but to treat it as an opportunity where NPOs from the beginning should be involved in talking and assessing whether it can help the relationship between the two. So it leaves some questions about how to handle this then in practice, which I hope that we can discuss collectively. I think some of the things that would be interesting is to find and share best practices in different contexts, to learn it from each other, to build this kind of network, which I think you are doing, but also to really understand the practical processes that go behind this and to turn them around to our advantage. And in that sense, I think that know your customer really can mean know your customer once we all get a say of how that process might look like. So that was these were my reflections, and I'm happy to answer some of your questions.